I don't want to be one of those writers that writes a boring book. And stories, if you tell a story well, it's impossible to bore your audience. You tell it in a way where you kind of lure them in by not telling them where you're headed. There's going to be a surprise, a twist at the end. I'm going to tell you the lesson to be learned, and it's not necessarily what you think. The people you think are the people being conned in the game end up being the con artists. That's from the 48 Laws. So I'm going to surprise you. And by doing that, I lure the reader in slowly into my way of thinking, into my world. And so now you're ready to consume a 600-page book with a lot of information, but it doesn't weigh you down because I'm trying continually to entertain you and tell you stories. And stories are what keep the mind engaged. And I tell writers a lot of times, that's what you're missing in your book. You're not paying attention to how the human attention span works. How many books I read by chapter 4, I'm already tuning it out because they just keep repeating the same information. They don't know how to entertain. So what I do is, I look for stories that have drama to them. And, I have a background in film and theater, so I kind of have a sense of what's dramatic, of where a good story could be, of where there's a human element where everybody can relate to. It's got to be something that everybody can relate to in some way. It could be a story of King Louis XIV, but on some human level, we can all relate to it. So I find those stories, and then if there's somebody famous, like a Napoleon Bonaparte, or Mary Shelley, as we talked about earlier, the woman who wrote Frankenstein, I read very long biographies, but I'm looking for little nuggets in those stories, in those books, that other people aren't looking at, but I think are extremely telling about that person's character. So that I'm going to surprise you. So one of the characters in The Laws of Human Nature that I talk about is Richard Nixon. He's the exemplary story of the shadow, the dark side of the human personality. And I was reading a very interesting biography of him, and it said that as a little boy, 3 years old, Nixon cried and cried and cried and cried more than any other baby they had ever seen. The mother didn't know how to make him shut up, and the father hated him because of it. Even the mother got irritated with him. I think, what does that say about Richard Nixon? What does that say about the man who became our president, who had all of these vulnerabilities, these wounds from his childhood that he had to cover up with this kind of macho front and this kind of paranoia about everybody? It showed that there was this little baby inside of him who had never been loved enough, who had never been held enough. And so I never read that in all my, nobody really had emphasized that. So I look for nuggets that reveal people's character that nobody's really talking about.
Well, mission accomplished for sure.
Yeah, you did a great job.
It works exactly how you intended.
No, absolutely. So I want to ask kind of a follow-up to that. So you bring up historical examples better than anybody I've ever read, frankly. But what motivated you in particular? What inspired you? And if you could think about a personal story or two about what inspired you to write The Laws of Human Nature and the 48 Laws of Power. I've heard you say in other interviews that you write out of anger sometimes. So that tells me something in Hollywood must have happened at some point in your life. And to the extent you're comfortable
We've read your book. We've read your book. We know what that means.
So I know that, every story comes from some personal motivation and personal experience, I am sure. So what motivated you in general to write the book? And if you could think about any personal experiences that if there's one or two that just sparked it, like, my God, people need to know about this and I need to make sure people understand this lesson.
Well, I had gone into working in Hollywood after having many different jobs with a lot of idealism, youthful idealism. This was going to be a great place for me to express myself. I could be creative. I could be a screenwriter. I come from Los Angeles, etc. And slowly I realized that it's not what my ideals were. It was an extremely Machiavellian environment, a very power-laden environment where people didn't so much pretend, but they acted as if all that mattered was creating a great movie. but in truth, it was really about their ego and about having power. And nobody was writing about this. And so, I worked for a film director, and he was not a bad person. He was a typical Hollywood director. And I saw him do some maneuvers that were actually quite nasty in looking back. He started out as a writer, and he wanted to direct his first film, but the producer didn't think he was experienced enough to direct this film. And so the man I was working for, he came up with this very clever strategy. He pretended to agree with the producer, and he said, all right, let me go find the right director first, or together we'll find the right director. And he purposefully found someone who he knew could not pull it off. He looked on paper to be potential to be the director, but he knew his character, he knew who he was, and he knew that it wasn't a slam dunk, but that 75% sure this guy would fail because he didn't have the character to take the pressure on. And also, the guy I knew was going to be applying some pressure. So he deliberately hired somebody he knew would fail, and would fail probably early on. And it happened. It happened in pre-production before the film ever got off, in the casting. And so this guy, the producer, had to come in and fire him. And then this guy, the last minute man I worked for, had to come in and rescue to become the director, which had been his goal all along. But in the process, he played it brilliantly, and I had to admire it and clap at how well he played it. But in the process, he kind of destroyed this other man's reputation, who I'm not positive about it because I haven't done the research, but I don't think he ever totally recovered. I don't think he directed another film. And then personally, for this one director, I would write a lot of his dialogue. He was a very intuitive man. He wrote everything on these yellow legal pads. And then suddenly he'd get blocked, and I would start stream of consciousness. I would take over, and I would write whole blocks of dialogue. Pages and pages were my writing. I never got credit. I never got paid. Nobody ever knew about this. And that's law number 7 in the 48 Laws of Power. Always let other people do the work, but always take the credit.
Oh,
that
wow.
had been played on me. But it's a typical thing in Hollywood or in media, where people, the researchers, the joke writers, Bill Maher doesn't write his own jokes. He has a team of people writing his jokes. You never see that. So I had this kind of I went in so idealistically, so wanting it to be this creative environment. And instead I saw all these kind of power games being played and nobody talking about it. And it pissed me off. It pissed me off that there was this rampant hypocrisy, that people think of all of these liberal-minded Hollywood directors and producers. They're always in the best causes. And I saw behind closed doors how mean-spirited, how they could be true assholes when the door is closed, how poorly they often treated their employees. And I wanted to expose the kind of power environment that I witnessed. And it isn't just Hollywood. It's the music industry. It's
politics.
It's academia. It's the medical world. It's every world. But Hollywood was kind of like a microcosm for me.
No, that's very, very, very interesting. You often say, people, you said this in the book, people bring the character they have to the position they occupy or the religion they practice. A person can be a Christian or a progressive liberal and still be a tyrant at heart. Ooh, that one was like, I could tell that was coming from a place of power and anger and that was just such a powerful line. When I thought about that, I just said, whoa, that is a mind blown type of line.
But it's true. It's true. It's not Christianity that's a problem. Christianity is a wonderful religion, and there are wonderful people who are Christians, but there are also bad Christians. There are also people who get into that religion and they use it for very dark purposes. We've seen it throughout history. And so it's not the religion itself, but it's what people bring to it. So you could be, a social justice warrior. You could be in favor of the greatest cause for humanity, but personally, you're not. You're not like that at all.
Yep.
And that happens over and over again.
Because, you say, I heard Ta-Nehisi Coates said this, if you've read any of his books, he has a line where he talks about, people that did really bad things, but they held themselves out to be good people. In order to do evil, one has convinced themselves they're doing good. So everyone, and you say that in your book, that everyone has this self-opinion that I'm good, I'm rational, I'm autonomous, and we want to all believe that.
Right.
But the truth is, people that probably have that certainty belief probably aren't any of those things. At least that's what I gathered from your book.
Well, if you're a true saint, if you're Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa, you don't need to broadcast it. Part of being a saint is you don't have an ego. You don't feel the need to go on social media and proclaim to the world, look at all the great things I'm doing. The best forms of charity, of altruism, is where the other person doesn't even know that you're doing it. You're hiding yourself so they don't feel beholden to you. You're not lording over them your act of charity. So a true saint doesn't need to promote him or herself. And the fact that you have to promote this is a sign of something a little bit dubious.
Yes, speaking and going a little bit of a different direction, but I think it's relevant to what you just said. You talked, this is a while back, and you did an interview in The Guardian speaking about vulture capitalism. You talked about people who sell this dream that's not true. And people honestly look up to leaders like this. They assume that, okay, we get there by being mean, being vindictive. You said this, the great thing about America is that you can come from the worst of circumstances. Somebody like 50 Cent, Jay-Z, their success are the people that we want to celebrate, not the vulture capitalists. Speak more to what you meant by that and how your books may speak to that.
What's the word, the vulture capitalists? Is that the word that I used?
You did.
I did, okay.
and we loved it. And we loved it. Oh man,
we loved it.
Incredible
we loved
word.
It. Yeah,
incredible phrasing.
I took out some of the other. It was the reference you were talking about. Just so I'll give you the full context. I know you've given a lot of interviews, so I'll give you the full quote.
Yeah.
You were talking about Obama and Mitt Romney and the perspectives of what you had then and why you had those beliefs and how we should celebrate success in America. So that was what you were talking about, and it was during that. It was in that conversation that you brought that up. So just so you know the context.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to completely answer exactly what you want here, but I'm always attracted to people's stories of people who kind of came from the worst circumstances and were able to raise themselves up. Because consider that, we talk about attitude. What happens to you in life is definitely going to affect your attitude. And if from very early on, nothing but negative stuff is being told to you about who you are, about the environment that you live in, you're going to internalize that. And people who overcome that, who've dealt with a lot of crap from very early on, who manage to salvage their soul and part of who they are and sort of their spirit, I think that's the greatest success story that I can imagine. Now, you might not think of 50 Cent in those terms, but I know him, I met him, I hung around with him. I met his grandmother. I know his where he grew up. I would spend time. I didn't live there, but I spent time in the streets where he grew up in Southside Queens. This was an extremely brutal environment. There is no logical reason why someone like that shouldn't be dead by now. In fact, everybody he knew growing up, most of them were either in prison or dead. And, a lot of what he did early on is a bit unsavory. He was selling crack cocaine. Let's call it what it is. But it was his only way of survival. He came from terrible circumstances. His mother she had him when she was like 16. She was murdered when he was 8 years old. So he was basically orphaned to his grandparents who had to raise like 18 other kids in a small house. He grew up in the crack epidemic. And, everything was against him. Yet he salvaged something about himself. He salvaged a sense of discipline, a sense of belief in himself. He kept his soul together. He credits his mother because he says that his mother was a very aggressive, ambitious woman. She had ambition. She wanted to be something in life. She was a drug dealer herself, but she wanted to get the hell out of it. And she wanted to protect him from that. He internalized that, and that saved his life. What a remarkable story that he was able, even after he had been shot and nearly died, to pick himself up after hardship, the worst kind of circumstance. These are amazing stories. And in Mastery, I have my favorite story of all of Zora Neale Hurston, who became a great novelist. Actually, she's an amazing novelist. And this woman came from an environment where it was not even remotely possible for her ever to achieve that. No Black woman had ever written a novel that ever made any kind of money that went, that was actually commissioned and paid money to write. And she was a maid working in rich people's houses. She had no money, no education, no chances. And yet with her attitude and her spirit and her discipline and her self-love and awareness, she became an incredibly successful novelist, the first Black female writer to ever make money writing. These are the kind of stories that are very American. We have a lot of stories in the 19th century of people like that. These are what we should be celebrating. The Donald Trump Juniors of the world, or even Donald Trump himself, who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, or the Bushes. I don't consider that interesting to me at all, because they were given, it's like running a 100-meter race and you get to start at the 50 yards into it, 50 meters into it. Of course you're going to win.
Yeah, I mean, my mother always said, you measure a person's success not by how far they've came, but the obstacles and the struggles they had to overcome in order to achieve that success. So I completely agree. It's something that my mother's really talked to me a lot about. So, and from a person, I grew up middle class, but I have a learning disability. And, my teachers told me I would never go to college and I almost failed the 2nd and 6th grade. I have 2 degrees now, long story bearable. But I had a mother that always infected me with the right attitude. She said, look, no one gets to define you. You define yourself, for yourself, by yourself. And so I am fortunate to have that, but others don't have that. Like 50 Cent didn't probably have that chance, and the fact that he got there is amazing. And I think it's easy to judge, to say he did something wrong or he did things that were criminal. But you know what? Lots of people make mistakes. And when you come from difficult circumstances, if you have to come from those circumstances, then you judge there first.